Good evening. On behalf of the Jesuits of Canada, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar, La Frontera, an Ignatian look into the U.S.-Mexican border, presented by Father Brian Strassburger. Before we start, a reminder that our webinar this evening will be 90 minutes. This will include the presentation and time for questions and answers. Please enter your questions in the Q&A box. If you put them into the chat, we might miss them. A link to this presentation will be sent to registered participants within 72 hours. And please change to the French channel if you would like to listen to the French translation. We begin with our land acknowledgement. Let us begin by acknowledging the Indigenous people of all the lands that we are on today. In Canada, from coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. It is my pleasure this evening to introduce Father Brian Strassburger. He is a Jesuit priest dedicated to serving migrant communities at the U.S.-Mexico border. He attended St. Louis University, where he majored in mathematics. His academic journey continued at Fordham University, where he earned a master's degree in international political economy and development, where he focused on issues affecting South Africa, including HIV/AIDS. During this time, he spent a summer working with the Jesuit Refugee Service in South Africa, deepening his commitment to serving displaced and the marginalized populations. For his Jesuit regency, Father Brian was missioned to Nicaragua, where he worked with the Roncalli Association, John the 23rd, assisting with small business development projects in rural communities. He now serves as the director of Del Camino Jesuit Border Ministries in the Diocese of Brownsville, Texas, where he responds to pastoral and humanitarian needs at the U.S.-Mexico border. His work is particularly focused on accompanying and supporting migrant communities, reflecting the Jesuit commitment to faith, justice, and the dignity of all people. Thank you, Father Brian, for being here.
Thank you, Pat. It's my pleasure.
And I'll turn it over to you.
Fantastic. I appreciate it. It's good to be with everyone. Thank you for joining me on this Thursday evening, as I'll share a little bit about my experience here on the U.S.-Mexico border and this Jesuit project that we have here, which I think it's kind of new and creative. And so I'd like to share a little bit about its origin and what we're doing. And I can't talk about what we're doing without talking a little bit about just the dynamic on this U.S.-Mexico border right now. And so I hope that's helpful in your own context, in your own ministry. We're obviously in kind of a new era politically right now. And so I'll shed some light on that. And then after sharing a little bit, open it up for questions and comments, and we can have a bit of a conversation. So to get started here, I'm going to share my screen as I have some slides and images that I want to use to help guide my presentation. So as Pat said, my name is Father Brian Strassburger. I'm a Jesuit priest. I was ordained in the summer of 2021 in New Orleans. And for my first mission, my provincial invited me to be part of a very small team to come down to the U.S.-Mexico border based in the Diocese of Brownsville, Texas. We had never had a Jesuit presence down here. There's no Jesuit high school or university or parish or retreat center, none of our classical institutions. But the provincial invited us to come down to this area of the border, the easternmost part of the border, which I'll talk about in a minute, and look for what kind of needs there were and how we could respond to them. So the first thing we did, which seemed like a sensible thing to do as priests in the church, was to meet with the local bishop here, Bishop Daniel Flores. And we met with him to have a conversation about what what our time down here could look like. And he's the one who gave us the instructions that I think became our call, because when we sat down and met with him, he said, I want you to do what I think Jesuits are best at. I was a little bit nervous he was setting me up for some sort of joke, but no, he said, what I want you to do is read the reality and respond to it. So he didn't tell us I need a Jesuit institution. He didn't say I need you to take over a parish. He didn't say I need a new high school down here. He said, I want you to come and read the reality and respond to it. And so that's what we've tried to do over the course of these 4 years. And reading that reality and responding to it has come to has found caused us to found Del Camino Jesuit Border Ministries. And our mission is to provide privileged and preferential religious care to the poor, with a focus on pastoral accompaniment and sacramental ministry with the migrant population on both sides of the US-Mexico border. So rather than being institutionally based, our mission ministry is itinerant. We have a residence that we live in Brownsville, but we are a mobile team. And so we don't have a brick and mortar institution. We don't have a building that we operate out of. Our ministry is flexible and discerning because we're not running a shelter and don't have one building to occupy. We can be flexible and discerning with where we spend our time and how we spend our time. Along with this focus on religious care, we also provide humanitarian aid. We collaborate with a lot of different actors, and we do a lot of advocacy around immigration. And I'll talk more about each of these points, but just wanted to introduce Del Camino at the start. So what does that mean practically speaking? What do we do? Principally, we celebrate Mass. We visit migrant camps and shelters, whether they're in Texas on the US side of the border or whether they're in Tamaulipas on the Mexican side of the border. We visit those shelters. We bring a little Mass kit. We set up a makeshift altar, sometimes just on top of a folding table. We bring the things that we need for the Mass. We ask people to gather around on benches or on seats, and we celebrate Mass with people, allowing them an opportunity to reflect on God's presence in their life and to ask for the graces that they need to get through the next day. And what happens that I think is so beautiful with that celebration of Mass, of going there and being present, offering the sacraments, is it creates this nice relationship of trust very quickly between us and migrants, especially Catholic ones who come and are invited and celebrate and are often very much desiring that. You know, it's not uncommon to meet migrants who've been on the road for months at a time and haven't had access to the sacraments when that was such a regular part of their life. We have a large amount of the migrant population we encounter is Catholic and identifies as Catholic. And so for them to see a priest walk in for the first time, maybe they've seen one in several months, and to offer the Mass right there where they are can be a very welcome respite amid a very difficult and challenging journey. And then as we establish this relationship of trust, it allows us to do a lot. For one, it allows us to orient migrants about the border dynamics. There's Migrants get their information from a lot of sources, just like anyone does, and that includes social media, especially, whether that's messages on WhatsApp, on Facebook, on TikTok. Some of that information is good and helpful, and some of it is completely inaccurate. And so we can help provide orientation to migrants about accurate information. What is the border dynamic? If you've heard some rumors, can we dispel those rumors or verify them for you? Can we tell you whether a source is trusted or not? And so we can be a helpful resource because of the knowledge base we have to migrants who are newly arriving on the border or dealing with the flood of information they get on social media. We're also able to pass information the other direction, hearing migrant stories in pastoral conversations as they talk about what's going on in their lives. We can elevate those on the ground issues to politicians, to advocates, to human rights experts. Sometimes it's things like noticing that there's been a spike in kidnappings of migrants in a city. And so we can report that to different authorities. Or that might be a technical issue. Migrants are using an app to get in the country, and all of a sudden this one error message is coming up from everybody. We can take a couple pictures of it, send it on to officials who run the app, and help advise them of what's going on. And so it's a great way for us to share information kind of going both directions, all just beginning principally with our celebration of the sacraments and building this relationship of trust. We also bring humanitarian aid to shelters, things like hygiene products and cleaning supplies, things to help supply the kitchens. We do advocacy efforts both on a local level where we talk with Mexican immigration authorities, U.S. immigration authorities to advocate for families. Right now, we're working to try to reunite parents with their newborn daughter who was born in Mexico in December. The parents crossed a week later while the daughter was still hospitalized because the couple had their appointment to enter the US and they knew that those were going to end with the change of government. And so they left their daughter with the newborn daughter's uncle. And so we're trying to talk with local authorities to find a way for this newborn child to be reunited with their parents on the US side. So that's kind of a local advocacy effort where we're talking with local CBP officials. That's Custom and Border Protection. Those are some of the officials for the US government that manage the border. We also advocate on a national level, talking with legislators to try to push policy reform. And then we have forms of communication that we're engaged in as well to share our ministry with others, including a newsletter that we send out and a podcast. That's a little bit about what our ministry looks like. But I want to return to that question of Bishop Flores, the invitation he had for us to read the reality and respond to it. So if we're going to talk about reading that response, let's talk about what the reality is that we encounter. So I'm coming to you from Brownsville, Texas, located in the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas, also known as the RGV. So it's the easternmost part of the 2,000-mile long border between the United States and Mexico. That border is the most frequently crossed international border in the world, with over 350 million legal crossings every single year. The border has never been closed and never will be closed, quote unquote. It's always a border that is regulated and has a frequent amount of crossing. The western half of the border from San Diego, Tijuana on the Pacific Ocean till El Paso, Ciudad Juarez is just lines in the sand, right? Lines just drawn through international agreements to separate boundaries between countries. In El Paso and Juarez is where the Rio Grande River comes down, descending from the state of Colorado in the middle of the US, and then it begins to form the border between Texas and Mexico. And that border continues until the Rio Grande River opens up into the Gulf of Mexico. That's what I'm going to call that body of water, and empties out into the Gulf. So we're located in that easternmost point where Brownsville is on the US side and Matamoros is on the Mexican side. And then about an hour west of us, McAllen's on the US side and Reynosa's on the Mexican side. And those kind of four city centers that are all kind of contiguous form one of the largest cross-border city centers along the whole US-Mexico border. If we're going to talk about the reality here, I don't want to skip over the reality on this side of the border in Texas. The city of Brownsville consistently ranks on the list of the poorest cities in the United States of America in terms of average salary per capita GDP, and has some of the worst health outcomes as well in terms of obesity and diabetes and things like that. So it's a very poor area in this part of the United States. But it's also a very Catholic area. The state of Texas is not known as being a particularly Catholic state. Countrywide in the United States, we're looking at between 20 and 25% of the population that might identify as Catholic. But here in this part of South Texas, where there's a lot of Mexican Americans, there's over 1 million Catholics, which is about 85% of the population. Even though it's extremely Catholic, it's under-resourced in terms of the priests that are here serving that very large Catholic population. So we have among the lowest priests per Catholic rates in the country. So there's only about 70 to 75 Catholic priests serving a population of over 1 million Catholics. So there's plenty of needs on the US side of the border in the Diocese of Brownsville, and with the poverty that we encounter here, even in these cities on this side of the border. But our presence here is really marked by the border reality. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. I have to begin by talking about what US immigration policy looked like in the final months under President Biden. So this is before January 20th. It's important to note that the US-Mexico border was not a quote unquote open border, which is often one of the phrases that you hear, especially in conservative circles, that it's an open border. The truth is, it was a highly regulated border, and the Biden policy strategy was a series of sticks and carrots. So I got that little clip art in the bottom left corner is the stick and the carrot. So the carrot was an incentivized system was using a smartphone app that you would download on your phone called CBP One. You could use that to schedule an appointment. There are almost 1,500 appointments assigned every day at one of 8 points of entry along the 2,000-mile border. It would take a few months. You'd have to ask for an appointment every day, and maybe eventually you would get that appointment. And then you could enter the country legally. You'd be granted a temporary parole, a temporary status in the country, and you would be eligible to apply for a work permit to work, and you could file an asylum claim if you had fear of returning to your home country. The other carrot was called the CHNV Humanitarian Parole Program, named for the four countries that it was available to, people from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. If you lived in one of those four countries and had a sponsor in the United States who applied on your behalf, you could be granted also a temporary parole to come to the US and also be eligible for a work permit and to file an asylum claim. So those were your carrots. There were ways to enter legally in the United States. Those were accompanied by an increased use of penalties for people who opted for anything other than those two options. So if you entered without a CBP1 appointment, let's say you didn't have a smartphone, you didn't understand how to use that technology, or let's say your situation was very urgent, you were getting threatening messages from the cartel in Mexico, and you just swam across the river and you're in the US territory, and you say, I'm sorry I didn't use this app that you told me I had to use, but or maybe you don't even know about it. You're like, look, I'm desperate. I'm seeking asylum. And our commitments to international law would suggest that we would honor that and review your valid asylum claim. But instead, starting at the end of the Biden administration, they put into place harsh penalties for people entered without a CBP1 appointment. You were quickly detained or deported. You were presumed ineligible to even apply for asylum unless you met a few very narrow exceptions. And so basically that was the stick. It was like if you didn't enter through one of these legal pathways, you were going to be heavily penalized. So what happened on January 20th? Well, on January 20th, the new administration quickly put an end to the CBP1 smartphone app and to the parole program. The only existing carrots were removed. That's why I put a new clip art with two sticks because there's no legal pathway for entry right now. The CBP1 application was shut down and they canceled all appointments that had been scheduled. So on January 20th, there were people in shelters across Mexico who had appointments scheduled already for January 20th, 21st, 22nd, 23rd, all the way out to February 9th because they scheduled appointments in advance. And they got a message at 11 a.m. On our local time saying, this app will no longer be used to schedule appointments, and every scheduled appointment has now been permanently canceled. You can imagine how devastating that would be for someone. I mean, we know people who have been waiting in the shelters since June and July in the summertime, well before the elections were even held, trying to do things the right way, asking for an appointment every day. You finally get the appointment, you're at the border awaiting entry, and you get this message saying, we are not going to respect or honor that appointment. And in fact, those who entered the country over the past couple of years using this application, including so many people we know, are now in a very tenuous position because they've just been granted a temporary parole, which the Department of Homeland Security here in the US has deputized immigration officials to revoke that parole at their discretion. And so even those who have entered are in a tenuous situation. All the sticks already put in place by the Biden administration, those harsh penalties for people crossing between ports of entry, continue to remain in effect. Basically, all these sticks had already been set up. All you had to do was revoke the two carrots, and the border was effectively closed. As if that wasn't enough, the new president issued an executive order claiming that there was an invasion happening on the southern border, and that gave him specific powers to prevent the entry of absolutely anyone to seek asylum in our country. That's been challenged in court, but as of now remains in effect, meaning that there is no way to come to the United States from the southern border and claim asylum. Some other things that have been talked about and we haven't seen started yet are mass deportations. There have been deportations that have started, that have continued, but they've been basically the same number of deportations we saw under the previous administration. There have been more targeted arrests in the country. But the thing is, it's hard to deport someone. You can't just arrest them and then deport them. There's still some legal process that they have to go through. And so we do think larger levels of deportations will begin soon, but they haven't yet. There's been talk about separating families that come into the country as well, detaining children. Those things haven't started again. There's the Remain in Mexico policy was a policy under the first Trump administration where people applying for asylum in the United States had to wait in Mexico for their court dates and would attend tent courts on the border and then remain in Mexico until a decision was reached. That hasn't gone into effect. Title 42 is a pandemic provision, basically saying because of COVID, we're not going to let anybody into the country. We'll just expel them immediately. That hasn't been put into effect either. So those are some things that have been rumored, but not yet put into effect. So what does that mean? What is the current dynamic? What's the result of all these policies? It means that access to the US for migrants and asylum seekers has been effectively eliminated. If you don't have a visa or a US passport, you cannot get into the United States. Basically, what we've converted into right now is a country club as opposed to receiving country for migrants. So if you are well educated and wealthy and have the right contacts, there are ways for you to enter. If not, you are not welcome here. That means on the US side of the border, the shelters here uh, are basically empty because no one can get into the country. And the shelters here on the US side along the border are temporary shelters where people arrive and then travel to their destinations across the country. Very few people stay in this area because they've got friends and contacts all over the country. What about the Mexican side of the border? The Mexican side of the border, migrants that we've known over the past few months are facing one of four possibilities. Number one, since there's no legal way of entering the country, they might consider other methods. Paying some coyote, that is to say, someone who does human smuggling, to be smuggled into the country, to pay someone to help them get into the country undetected by US Border Patrol. Right now, the going rate is between 12 and 15,000 US dollars per person for someone to do that. So for many people, it's not even an option financially. For others, they have no interest in breaking laws and ending up undocumented in the United States. So I've known a couple of people who have made that choice, but very, very few. We've known some people who have returned to their home countries or to their homes within Mexico if they think it's safe enough to do so. Many people flee for violence and insecurity. Others, it's complex reasons. They might not feel safe, super safe in their home country, but they have family there, but they might have family in the United States, and so they might desire to reunite with them. But those who can return to home, some have. Others have tried to relocate within Mexico, so non-Mexican nationals like a Venezuelan or Haitian family, for example, relocating to a larger city like Monterrey or Mexico City or Guadalajara, bigger, safer Mexican cities, trying to look for work, get their kids in school, and establish themselves there for at least for the time being. And then others are in the shelters who are just waiting. They have no other options. Oftentimes, it's a single mom with small children who can't even work to support herself because she has to care for small kids. In other cases, it's people who were kidnapped in Mexico and had all their documents stolen. So it's not safe for them to even travel around Mexico because they don't have a passport or status in the country, and they could be arrested and detained or deported. And so they remain in shelters and are trying to enroll kids in school and maybe look for jobs in the nearby in the shelters in these cities, which are really hard to come by. So that's the situation people are facing on the border right now. So that's a little bit about the reality. The bishop asked us to read the reality and also to respond to it. So we have to ask ourselves, who is responding? What is the response that we've seen over the past few years here on the border and currently? Is the government responding? Truth is, there's limited to no humanitarian support from the US or Mexican federal governments. Mexico, over the past year, has been heavily policing the interior of Mexico to prevent migrants from even arriving at the border. So their strategy has been, let's keep migrants off the US-Mexico border. Let's keep them out of northern Mexico. So if Mexican immigration authorities encounter a migrant traveling along the highway between cities, they will take them and they won't deport them because deporting someone requires more paperwork, more money. It's a more complicated process. But what they found out they could do very easily is just put them on a bus and ship them back to southern Mexico, right near the border with Guatemala. So cities along that southern part of Mexico near the border with Guatemala have been filled with migrants in Tapachulas, in Villahermosa, in Tuxtla Gutierrez. Those are a few of the cities located near the Guatemalan border where Mexico keeps sending migrants, basically forcing them to stay in the south of Mexico, effectively moving the border dynamic, the migrant border dynamic from the actual border between the US and Mexico down to southern Mexico, a part of the country that's very poor and very unsafe. What about the US? How has the US been responding? Well, they've been cutting funding that supports shelters and NGOs internationally and domestically. They've been criminalizing migrants in the country and targeting them for deportation and detention. So that's been the way they've been responding. I can talk about just the state I live in the state of Texas, where the Attorney General of the state has been trying to bring to court nonprofit organizations that provide humanitarian aid to migrants, accusing them of illegally trafficking people, which of course has not been the case. The governor of our state has spent over $11 billion in a project called Operation Lone Star. That was 11 billion as of September of last year, which included a busing program targeting certain cities in the US to drop off large number of migrants unsupported, putting up more and more levels of razor wire along the border, including razor wire that's underwater, where migrants have swam and got caught in it and had severe lacerations because of it. And the truth is, we're likely to see more support for any of these anti-immigration policies under the new administration, as you can imagine. So that's the government's response, criminalizing migrants, making it much more challenging on them, discriminate against them, deportations. How about the media? How is the media responding? I get concerned with some of the language that the media uses when talking about the border and migration. For the past year, couple years, especially in the election cycle, I heard it referred to over and over again as the border crisis or the migration crisis. Cardinal Czerny, who works in the Dicastery of Human Development in Rome, uh, said that we can never describe migration as a crisis. Migration is not a crisis. Migration is one of the most human things we can do. I myself moved around 5 times in the first 10 years of my life as my dad was getting different jobs and work opportunities. So many of us migrate. A human impulse is to migrate, especially if you need to seek safety or opportunity to support your family. Migration is a human phenomenon, not a crisis. The crisis might be a humanitarian one provoked by politics and policies that govern our borders. That's the crisis that we need to be addressing, not the very fact that people migrate. Here in the US, we love the phrase, unfortunately, illegal migrants, especially in the media. And a lot of times I feel like it's mischaracterizing the population, overgeneralizing it. One easy way to demonstrate this is if a migrant over the past few years had crossed between ports of entry and been processed by Border Patrol and released into the US, media might refer to them as an illegal migrant even though they have paperwork allowing them to be in the country and have been processed by our government and have court dates to attend. They're described as illegal because they entered between ports of entry, which is a misdemeanor under uh, US law, and it's not a criminal offense. And yet we call them illegal migrants. It's the equivalent of getting a speeding ticket in terms of its breaking of US law. Another thing that has been happening under the new administration is describing the CBP One app, the smartphone app, as an illegal app of the Biden administration. By calling it an illegal app, the new president and his administration is trying to cast all the people who entered the country with that app as an illegal migrant. Even though they did everything the right way, they tried to follow all the right things, but now they're being criminalized, being described as illegal because they used an illegal method of entry into the US, even though at that time it was absolutely a legal entry of legal form of entry. The other phrase that gets used in the media and by politicians a lot is this word invasion, that there's an invasion on the US-Mexico border. And I can tell you, every time I hear that word, I glance outside my window here in Brownsville, waiting to see the bombs being dropped or people running by with guns flooding in our city. And of course, I never encounter that. There's no invasion here. You can walk peacefully around the streets of Brownsville, even when we had 1,000 people crossing the border in this sector every single day. It was very controlled and regulated by migration authorities and Border Patrol. You could walk calmly down the streets of Brownsville and never even know it was happening. So to describe it as an invasion, I find is very not only incorrect, but also outrageous, especially when I think about the situation in Ukraine or in Gaza, in terms of places where people are being bombed on a regular basis in their homes where they live. What the media tends to do is focus on tragedies and viral stories. There was this completely false account of of migrants eating pets in a city in Springfield, Ohio. that was completely unsubstantiated but went viral. Many of you might even have heard the story. So those are the kind of stories that get shared, not the border reality, not the lives of migrants living down here and the way policies affect them, but fake stories that go viral. And then, of course, there's politicians in the media who use phrases like we need to secure the border, which I find insulting to the many CBP, Customs and Border Protection, or Border Patrol officers that are members of our parish who do their job very well and work very hard to maintain our border. And so to call it a border that is not secure, there's that we always need to work on increasing our security, prevent the trafficking of people and weapons going south into Mexico and money going south into Mexico to fund cartels and fentanyl and other narcotics being trafficked into the United States. So there is work that needs to be done, but there's oftentimes a lot of mischaracterizations. So if it's not the government and if it's not media that's responding well to the border reality, who is? It's really the nonprofits and the NGOs. And here I share a picture from Catholic Charities for a meeting we had here in the Rio Grande Valley of the Jesuit Migration Network. Those of you who know Norbert might recognize him sitting up front, who came and attended that conference and that meeting. And so Catholic Charities here in the Rio Grande Valley is one of the local NGOs. We count ourselves as one of them. It's NGOs that are running the shelters, providing humanitarian aid, advocating for migrants, caring for medical needs, providing education and activities for youth and children, and offering sacramental and pastoral care like we do. How do we think of our own response? Well, as Jesuits and as Catholics, we think of our response as a Catholic one, rooted in our Catholic faith and tradition. When we met with Bishop Flores after being here for a year or two, he pointed out this passage from Pope Francis, Evangelii Gaudium, that I think really captures well the heart of our ministry. Pope Francis writes, I want to say with regret that the worst discrimination which the poor suffer is the lack of spiritual care. The great majority of the poor have a special openness to the faith. They need God, and we must not fail to offer them His friendship, His blessing, His word, the celebration of the sacraments, and a journey of growth and maturity in the faith. Our preferential option for the poor must mainly translate into a privileged and preferential religious care. I think that speaks to the heart of our ministry here. The poor are discriminated against in so many ways, and I found it so impactful that Pope Francis identified the worst discrimination, the worst, not as the lack of housing or the lack of humanitarian aid or the lack of food. He said the worst is the lack of spiritual care. We can see their openness to the faith and they're being denied the access to the sacraments in the church. We talk a lot about the preferential option for the poor. I remember studying that when I learned about Catholic social teaching. But Pope Francis talks about how we really need to think about preferential religious care. So even though we see the Diocese of Brownsville as an underserved diocese in terms of the Catholics who are here, and we do try to help out the diocese locally, we focus on our care for the poor and particularly for the migrants in the shelters here. And it's this mentality that it shapes and forms our work. So how do we respond? Some of the shelters we visit include Casa del Migrante and Senda 2 that are located in Reynosa, Mexico. We used to visit the Humanitarian Respite Center located in McAllen, Texas, but now that the border is closed, it's empty. There are no migrants on this side of the border, and so we've stopped going to the Humanitarian Respite Center. We visit the Pumarejo shelter, which is located in Matamoros, Mexico. Uh, and then we also have a history of visiting centers in the United States for unaccompanied minors. So kids under the age of 18 who have come to the border without a parent or legal guardian. Once they're encountered by Border Patrol or CBP, they're placed in facilities, centers, and are assigned a caseworker who verifies that they're not being trafficked and that they're being released into the United States to either an appropriate foster home or to a family member, a designated family member. And so we've had a history of entering those centers and celebrating Mass with the young kids. At this point, the number of unaccompanied minors in the United States has got significantly lower, and so we've temporarily suspended those services. So I've been sharing a lot of information, a lot about the reality down here and what we do. But the truth is, I want to share stories. I mean, that's what touches the heart. That's what our ministry is really all about, is getting to know people, hearing their life. And so every migrant has a story, and I'd like to share just a few of them with you before I talk about ways we encourage people to respond to the reality and then opening up for questions and conversation. So the first story I want to tell is about Catalina and her kids. She's got four kids. She's a single mom. She fled Venezuela after her mother was murdered, and she was engaged in with the um Fiscalia. I can't remember how to say it in English. Uh, with the with the legal process to find out who it was that had make accusations against the people who committed the murder. And she was receiving threats, and so she took her four kids and fled Venezuela. And she or fled Colombia. I'm sorry, she's Colombian, so it happened in Colombia. She came up to the border, the U.S.-Mexico border, and she had a CBP-1 appointment for January 21st. She had been kidnapped when she arrived on the border a few days before. And once she got released, she was in the shelter as she found out that her appointment with CBP-1 had been canceled. But Catalina is a resourceful young woman, single mother. And so one of the things that I found very moving was that when Father Flavio, a member of our team, uh, offered to baptize and offer first communion for kids who have never been baptized or received their first communion, Catalina was one of the first to jump on that. She said, "Yes, I want to take advantage of this time that I'm here in this shelter as I figure out what to do." She's stuck. She doesn't have any of her documents. They were all stolen when she was kidnapped, but she's taking advantage of this time as hard as it is for her. She's trying to take advantage of this time and offer these sacraments to her kids that she hasn't been able to do before. And so it was just a couple weeks ago, the start of March, we had our first catechism meeting. Pictured in the bottom right is Father Flavio speaking to people, parents especially, who are going to have their kids baptized. Just talking about the basics of baptism. What is it? What are the signs? The water, the white garment, the candle, and what do these represent? And I took that photo, and Catalina is sitting right to my right, so you don't see her in the picture. But she's sitting right next to me, and she was just on the edge of her seat and just listening to every word. And she leans over to me and she said, "Father Brian, I am here to learn." So she was very excited. This wasn't some passive event of like, I just need to pass the time. I'll baptize my kids. She was super engaged. And she's been that way since. Every meeting we're there, she's one of the first to throw up her questions, throw up her hand with questions, or try to answer when questions are presented. So she's clearly very engaged and dialed into the faith. So when I think about us closing the border to vulnerable migrants, I think about Catalina. I think about how her mother's been murdered. She's fleeing her home country. She's a single mom traveling with her kids. She's a woman of faith trying to engage and learn more. And that this is the profile of a migrant that we might be trying to deny access to safety and security within the United States. Another person I think about is Kaylee and her kids, Ashley and Tiago. They're staying at a shelter in Reynosa, Mexico that we call Send It To be honest, calling it a migrant shelter is pretty generous. It's just a large concrete wall that was built around a couple of baseball fields. And people are living in tents or these small four-walled buildings, these little casitas that recently have been plagued by bed bugs. And so we're trying to get the mattresses burned and cleaned out. But just to say, it's really, really poor conditions. But we visit Send It To twice a week and celebrate Mass there. And since January 20th, the profile of the migrants in the shelter, especially those joining for our Mass, has changed. It's basically become a children's Mass. As you can see in the picture in the top center, most everyone sitting in those seats are the kids. They look forward to it. When we rolled in just a couple of weeks ago in our minivan to celebrate Mass, all the kids were playing on the playground. And Tiago, who in that top center picture is on the bottom right, wearing kind of jeans and a black t-shirt, uh, he peered up over the wall of the playground where they were all playing. He saw us rolling in and he yelled out, "La Misa," which is the Mass. And all the kids started screaming and yelling, and they left the playground and ran over to the kitchen area where we set up our chairs and celebrate Mass. And so it's just a delightful thing to see how much they're engaged and how much they hunger for it and look forward to the conversations that we have and the celebration of the Mass and learning the different prayers and responses. It's just so engaging for them. And the truth is, I mean, they're in a really tough shelter, a lack of resources there. Migrants don't feel safe leaving the center because the outside of it is watched over by the local cartel. There have been a lot of cases of migrants being kidnapped just outside the walls of the shelter. They maintain security 24 hours a day. And so people feel effectively trapped in there. They stay in the shelter. They do not leave the shelter. There are some outside Mexicans that come in and sell like um, recharges to your cell phone to have data and minutes to use your cell phone. They might come and for a fee, they'll withdraw money from an ATM that your family might send you or something like that. So, um, but people feel pretty trapped within that shelter. But you can see how loving and caring they can be. Joe Noya, one of the Jesuits in our community, who's a Jesuit scholastic, so he's in formation to be ordained eventually. He celebrated his birthday at the end of February, and so we had the kids give him a blessing, and you can see in the bottom right corner, he felt awkward standing up with the kids raising up their hands to him, so he knelt down on the ground before them and bowed his head, and all the kids gathered around and placed their hands on his head and prayed for him. And that includes Kaylee, who's the mom of the two kids, Tiago and Ashley. Kaylee, she sits by the cell phone charging station, but joins in our mass every day. She got to the shelter back in October, was asking for an appointment with CBP1, never got the appointment. She's a single mom with these two kids stuck in the shelter. They love coming to the mass and participating in it, but their prospects are bleak. They're really not sure what to do or what next steps are. So for now, they continue to remain in the shelter. We see them on Tuesdays and Thursdays when we go to visit. Another story I'd like to share is a little bit more hopeful. It's kind of a success story and the kind of story that I really need to hold on to, especially when time gets tough. And that's the story of Nessie and her kids, Dylan and Alexa. Nessie and her kids are from Honduras and they fled a difficult situation there. She's a single mother, came to the shelter here in Reynosa about a year ago and started asking for an appointment with CBP1. They're very participatory in the mass. Dylan, the little boy, loves to sing. Now he's a terrible singer, but I would never tell him that. And whenever we'd get to the communion part of the mass, he'd always ask for the microphone to sing out a church song a cappella, and to everyone's delight. You can see the smiles on people's faces as he would sing and belt out his song. And he was such a loving and caring little boy. As you do a little art project with him, and he'd sit next to you, he'd look over after you and say, Father Brian, I just love you so much. I love you so much. Thanks for sitting with me. Just such a kind and loving kid. Well, they eventually got their appointment with CBP1 back in the day where that was a legal way to enter, where you could get the appointment, enter the country. So after being in the shelter for about 4 months, they entered about a year ago, a little bit less than a year ago, and traveled to North Carolina where Nessie's sister lives. They reunited with her sister and her sister's newborn baby. You can see the photo of their reunification on the right side of the screen as they met in the airport. Nessie's sister had balloons to give to little Alexa. And the kids are enrolled in school now. But Nessie, single mom, doing the best she can to get by. She got a work permit, doing everything the right way she can. She's got a job at Walmart in the evenings. She works nights at Walmart and got a job at the local school district, working two jobs to try to support her family, pay her bills. In late November, I got a message from her as we were entering the Advent season and approaching Christmas. She said to me, you know what, Father Brian, she would check in every month or two anyway. I hear from her regularly. So it wasn't strange. So we greeted each other, asked how everybody was, etc. She sent me a couple photos of the kids and a voice message from Dylan. And then she said, Father Brian, the reason I'm reaching out is because it's the holiday season coming up. It's Christmas, and that's a time for us to think about the many blessings and gifts we have in our life, just like the blessing of Jesus. And it got me thinking about the 4 months I lived in that shelter. And you know what, Father Brian, I want to make a gift to the shelter for Christmas. I want to send $100 to that shelter. I was just so taken aback by that, the sense of her generosity, a single mom working two jobs just to care for her two kids. And she's not just thinking about what gifts can I buy my kids for Christmas this year. She's thinking, I want to give money back to that shelter I stayed in for 4 months. And not only that, she told me. So not only that, Father Brian, I also talked to 5 other migrants who were staying at the shelter with me at that time and got them to also commit to making a $100 gift. So for Christmas this past year in December, we helped facilitate a $600 gift for migrants who had been in the shelter and are now living in the United States to give it to the shelter in northern Mexico. It reminds me of the gospel story when Jesus is in the temple and sees the treasury and people buy these large sums of money. And then all of a sudden, this poor widow comes up and she puts a few small coins in there worth a few cents. And Jesus says that's the one who gave most generously because she gave from her very life and livelihood. I think about that story when I think about Nessie, who gave from what little she had, but gave with love and generosity. That's someone who I'm so glad is living in the United States of America, who's part of our country, who's working legally, contributing to our society and culture. She's a great representative of our Christian faith and just a great human being. We need more people like Nessie in this world. She challenges me to be a better, more generous, more loving person. So those are a few stories of faith that I wanted to share. Where are they now? I always like to pull up this graphic just to highlight that immigration is not a border issue. This is especially relevant as I talk to parishes and groups across the United States. These are the destinations where I've known migrants to go in my 4 years working on the border. If you notice, literally every state of the 48 contiguous United States has a marker in it because I've known people who have gone to every state, even the more remote states with lower populations like North Dakota and South Dakota and Montana and Wyoming and Vermont and Maine. So there are migrants in every community across the country, and they enrich our country, they enrich our communities, they enrich our churches. So often when we talk about immigration, we think a lot about the border, but the truth is, migrants are members that are part of our communities all across the country. And the same is true in Canada, of course. So immigration is something that enriches all of our countries and all of our cultures. So people often ask, okay, Father Brian, read the reality, respond to it. How can I respond to it? So I like to give a couple of ways people can respond. This is most relevant to U.S. Citizens, especially. So I'll go through these pretty quickly. But coming to see the border reality is really helpful. And so I think even though immigration is very present in every community, the border gets so talked about and so mischaracterized. People find it very eye-opening when they come and see the actual reality. But that, of course, can be coupled with volunteering locally. Every community in the US, every community in Canada has migrants. And especially here in the US right now, there's a lot of fear and uncertainty. I get messages from migrants in the country that I've known all the time who are asking, am I okay, Father Brian? Should I go to this court date? Should I go to work? Should my kids go to school? And I try to provide them with accurate information. It is an uncertain time, but there are certain precautions they can take. There are certain rights that they have. And most people I know have documentation to be legally in the country, but even that isn't a guarantee under the current administration that continues to criminalize migrants. And of course, people can support organizations that work on behalf of migrants. Like I said, most of the response is through NGOs. So things like we run a wish list of Amazon wish list of items that we bring to migrant shelters. We can always use financial support to help with our humanitarian aid. And then, especially for US citizens to advocate for change, to call up your senators and representatives and be a voice for the voiceless. This is probably true in Canada as well. Migrants in our countries cannot vote, despite what some extremists might say. They're not registering secretly to vote and casting votes in elections, right? They don't have a vote in our political system. That's why they're an easy target. Uh, you know, uh, Trump, when he was running for president, was talking about migrants and the problem they are, demonizing them, criminalizing them, saying they are the problem. We need mass deportations. It's an easy population to target because they don't vote. If he had been gone around saying Catholics are a big problem in our country, we need to get rid of Catholics, they're causing all the problems, that would have had real impact in the ballot box because a lot of Catholics in the country would say, I don't agree with that. I'm going to vote for somebody else. But if you talk really bad about migrants, it's only secondary voices who are going to say, I don't like the way you're talking about that group because migrants themselves can't vote for themselves. And so, how can we be a voice for the voiceless in Canada, in the United States? And in this country in particular, we need to talk to our representatives about opposing this ban of asylum, these harsh sticks that are penalties that are put in for people coming to our country seeking relief, and these mass deportations that our president is seeking out. And then, of course, the other way to support us is by listening to our podcast. So, just ending with a little plug for the Jesuit Border podcast. If you're curious about what I'm sharing, if you enjoy the stories that I've shared, we release new episodes every week. We're midway through season 8 right now. If you have Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any other app where you download podcasts, we're available on just about all of them. Just search for the Jesuit Border Podcast. We interview great people doing work around the country and around the world in some cases. We just released an episode with the director of Jesuit Refugee Services in Europe, Father Alberto Ares, a Jesuit from Spain who lives in Brussels right now. We also share stories from our ministry, so please check that out and listen to more. So with that, I'm gonna close the presentation window and stop sharing my screen so that I can get my face back up here. I know I've given a lot of information, talked a lot about our ministry and the reality down here, but we still have plenty more time for conversation. So now I'm going to turn it over to Pat to help facilitate questions and comments, and I'll respond to them as best I can.
Thank you, Brian. Um, you've mentioned a lot of thought-provoking issues that will challenge us as we reflect on your presentation. Before I ask the questions, before I start asking questions, I wanted to just ask you if you wouldn't mind sharing the issue that you were telling me about with ice and the wine for Eucharist. Would you mind sharing that with them?
Sure. Yeah, I was telling Pat before we got on the call that I'm in a little bit of a sour mood right now, right as I got on the call, because I was dealing with a sudden emergency situation in my eyes. Because with the changing reality on the U.S. side of the border, we're not going to shelters here, temporary shelters, because they're empty because no one's getting into the country. So we've tried to pivot, and we want to go into detention centers where migrants who are detained and being held to be able to provide the sacraments there, to go in and celebrate Mass and talk with people. And so we had to submit items that we need to bring in to get approved by ICE, by US Immigration. And so I submitted the things that we bring in our mass kit. And they denied us the ability to bring the wine into the facility. That was very alarming and concerning to me because as a Catholic priest, for me to be able to celebrate Mass, I need to have the bread and the wine to be able to celebrate Mass, even though the wine, which becomes, of course, the blood of Christ, could only be consumed. It'd be fine if it was just consumed by the priest, but both species need to be present for the Mass. And so uh, I'm hopeful that there's a misunderstanding going on because as we were waiting to start the call, I was looking up ICE's policies, and they have a specific policy for wine used for sacramental purposes. So I think maybe there was a misunderstanding there, and I think this could be corrected, but it definitely got me pretty frustrated to think that we're in an environment now where there would even be thoughts that we would deny religious expression for Catholic detainees from immigration authorities by denying them access to the Mass because I can't bring in a little tiny little plastic container of wine that I sent them a picture of. So things that definitely concern me. But that's the environment we're living in right now.
Thank you. Can you tell us about your work in Mexico? How do you navigate working on both sides of the border, given the different policies in the US and Mexico?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's interesting working in kind of this binational reality. I mean, obviously, I benefit tremendously. Our team benefits tremendously by being U.S. citizens. So it's very easy as a U.S. citizen to cross the border with a U.S. passport. We also have a special kind of express pass that you can get called Sentry. Also, Global Entry is another similar one. So we can enter quicker in a separate line going in and out of the country. It's a great privilege. I mean, I recognize that every time I'm with the migrant population in Mexico, just how easy it is for us across the border. Even a typical U.S. citizen might wait 2 or 3 hours in a line of cars to get into the country, but with the Express Pass, we can get in and out in a matter of minutes, which is a great blessing and facilitates our ministry. Working on the Mexican side of the border, we of course need the approval of the local bishop. Bishop Lira in Matamoros and Reynosa has been extremely supportive of our work, and so he gives us faculties to celebrate sacraments over there. Um, and yeah, I mean, the policies that govern the border are kind of mostly US policies, and then it's Mexico responding to those policies with how they handle things. And so we partner with a lot of Mexican organizations. We go to Mexican shelters, we work with Mexican partners, and so we have a ton of partnerships on both sides of the border. Collaboration is just the name of the game. There's literally dozens of organizations on both sides of the border that we collaborate with on a very regular basis. And so none of our work would be possible without those deep relationships that are very helpful for us.
Are there men in the shelters or are they mostly women and children?
Yeah, there are certainly men in the shelters. I mean, most of the shelters right now, today in northern Mexico, are mostly women and children. Some of them are complete families, so a husband and wife and their kids. That's a pretty good portion too. So most of the men we see, like single adult men, most of them have moved to the safer cities that I talked about, like Monterrey and Mexico City, places where they can more safely go out and work every day because they don't have any dependents. They don't have to worry about anybody during the daytime hours. But families, including husband and wife with kids, if they don't have documents or things like that, they might be staying at shelters still. The husband might actually go out during the day and try to look for work, maybe a construction site in Reynosa or something like that, while the mom stays at home and stays in the shelter, tries to take care of the kids. So um, there are some men in the shelters, but usually with families, there's almost no single men. There are some single women who are still in the shelters, but no single men. Only parents of families. Right now, that's just a snapshot of March 20th, 2025.
Do you get questions from undocumented people who may be subject to these deportations about coming to Canada?
Great question. Yeah. I don't work a lot with the undocumented population in the US. We're mostly on the border, and most of the people who over the past 4 years come to the border, stay at our shelters, the vast majority of them enter through legal pathways, things like the CBP One app. So they have documentation. And I do get a lot of questions from them, including even from that documented population, because their documentation is not solid and lasting. So I get questions sometimes from them asking about Canada as an option. I get that every once in a while. The other thing that I've had recently is now that the border is closed, where you cannot come into the country, people are encountering a lot of things online that are offering, and these are all scams, internet scams, offering visas to Canada or to the United States to live and to work. So I was just sitting with a young woman from Honduras with her daughter. Her daughter just had her birthday today. Loani just turned 13. We had a birthday cake for her in the shelter and gave her a little blessing. And but her mom was showing me something. She's like, I've been on this website. It looks like a legit website. I'm taking a look at it. It's got great pictures. It's got links. Everything checks out. She's been chatting with WhatsApp with one of their representatives, and it's offering visas to come to Canada. And now they've gotten at the point where the person in the WhatsApp chat is asking her to send this company $500 to process the visa. And so I took some screenshots of it. I sent it to some people who confirmed that this is a scam. This is not a legitimate method for getting a visa to come to Canada. And so people are really looking for ways to exploit migrants. And that includes right now because they're so vulnerable. They're sitting there, they're like, there's got to be some way to get in the US. Let me see, how do I get a US visa? Okay. Now, if you make yourself very searchable on the internet, now is a great time to tell someone, I can get you a visa into the United States. Fill out this paperwork. I'll send you something that looks official that I just made on my computer. I'll ask you for some money, and then you're not going to hear from me again. And you have no recourse to request this money back. So we're seeing a lot of those scams popping up right now, unfortunately.
Have you encountered any opposition, even from within the church, regarding your work? If so, how would you respond in an Ignatian way?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. I would say mostly we've gotten mostly positive responses. I like to focus on that. There's a lot of people who have been very encouraging of us when the new administration took over and when we released a newsletter to explaining what we're seeing and what the situation was like. Just an overwhelming response from people within the network and otherwise, just saying, "Thank you for what you're doing. This must be so hard. You're in our prayers," and that sort of a thing. So, got a really, I think, a very moving response from so many people. But occasionally we encounter people with differing opinions. And I always like to, I mean, I'm always very happy to engage on the issue, especially with a fellow Catholic, because what I tend to find is that a lot of the misunderstandings and very passionate views that tend to be anti-migrant are very poorly informed. And I try to keep myself extremely well informed on issues related to the border because this is my life. And so the Ignatian way is to walk in somebody's door and try to get them to walk out yours. And so that is to say, meet them where they're at, ask them what they're struggling with, ask them what they're concerned about, and try to approach them through that direction. But I had a time where I gave one of these presentations and someone wanted to really engage on the issue, was very upset about some of what I shared. And we couldn't really get to a good place. But he started by saying, I know people who are migrants. I know this person, I know that person. But then he said a lot of anti-immigration rhetoric that's very common. And so at the end, when I realized that he wasn't going to come to an agreement with the differing facts and information I was providing, saying that he has his own information, he has his own information. I realized we weren't going to get to an agreement there, but I remembered that we could share the agreement that there are people we're close to that have migrated and that we love. And so the people that I was sharing about in my stories are people that I love and care about. And I'm glad to know that he has migrants in his life that he too loves and cares about. And that is, of course, the heart of the Christian message. So just I always try to end any conversation by finding the most common ground possible. And I always hope that our common shared faith is something we can lean into. But mostly, I will say, people seeking me out, trying to talk to me, tend to be people who are predisposed to want to hear these things and want to be encouraging and supportive of our work. But I'm always happy to engage someone else who has differing opinions because I often find the difference of opinion is rooted in misinformation.
What are your thoughts on the tension between migration as a human phenomenon and the laws of nation states?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a really great question. I mean, I think we sit in that tension, right? We sit in that tension that the church itself has acknowledged that in a world of nation states, I mean, th that's what we have right now. That's not divine law. That's human law. Humans have developed nation states. That hasn't been the entirety of human history, but that's the current reality we live in. And so, with nation states, there is a right for nation states to create laws to protect themselves and to regulate migration. And so, I don't have any problem with regulation of migration, especially oriented towards the safety of countries. I think that's the world we live in, and that is perfectly reasonable. What concerns me is when policies are put into place that don't allow for the movement of people, that outright disallow it, where legal pathways to entry are completely closed off. I mean, even before this new administration took office, I mean, for someone, if you're, let's say your name's Jose, your wife's Maria, and you got a young kid named Jesus, and you live in Honduras, and the cartel is threatening to is demanding money from you, or they're going to kill your kid, and they're taking pictures of Jesus going in and out of school every day, and saying, if you don't pay us this $500 a month, we're going to kill Jesus, and you decide you're going to leave and you're going to look for safety, and you've got some extended family living in the United States. Okay, there's no legal way for you to get to see them. There's no legal pathway. The only way you could possibly come here is coming into the country and asking for asylum. And even then, your asylum claim is not supported by international law because it's not the local government that's persecuting you, it's the local cartel. But asylum law was written in the 1950s, post World War II, when Nazi Germany was exterminating people. And so it's never been updated to meet our current time and reality. And so when I hear the phrase that people need to get in line, well, when no line is presented to him, and now more than ever, there is no line, literally no line presented to people, then how can we say that we're balancing that human impulse to migrate, especially for safety and security and for opportunity? There's no balance. There's a complete imbalance. There's a favoring of nation states and political borders over the human person and the impulse to migrate.
Has the Vatican or any global Catholic organization played a role in supporting your work on the ground?
We feel extremely supported by the bishops here. I mean, that is the most, I mean, we could not be doing the work we're doing without the great support we get from Bishop Flores on this side and Bishop Lira on the other side of the border. And Pope Francis has been one of the biggest advocates of course, for migrants in his whole pontificate. Just a month ago, he sent a letter to U.S. bishops talking about migration and without mentioning politicians by name was directly responding, I think, in the content of his letter to things said by local politicians, in particular the Vice President J.D. Vance and some comments he made in light of his own Catholic faith. And Pope Francis offered a corrective, talking about the impulse to love not being restricted, not being prioritized to our family members and only limited to beyond that, but rather that impulse of the Good Samaritan that really we're called, who is our neighbor? It's the person in need, the vulnerable person. And so I think Pope Francis has been one of the best advocates for our ministry, even though we don't have kind of direct contact with him. But we're grateful for that support from our Jesuit province, from the local diocese, and even just implicitly through his words and statements and his pontificate by Pope Francis as well.
Have you observed changes in the demographics of people arriving at the border since these policy shifts?
Right now, nobody can get to the border because Mexico has been policing Mexico. So migrants who are coming to Mexico right now can't get out of southern Mexico. So no one's arriving at the border. That's why the population is declining because people are left with one of those four options, and none of them are new arrivals. So they're all people who are deciding to either cross illegally, reestablish themselves in Mexico, return home, or just stay in the shelter. But because Mexico's policing all of Mexico, not letting migrants come north, people are not arriving at the shelters. So the demographic at the shelters is just a declining population right now. That could change. Dynamics change on the border. I've been here 4 years. It's not like it was one way during Biden. Now it's one way under Trump. It's more like every 6 to 8 to 12 months, some new policy comes up or some new dynamic happens. And some of that has involved demographic dynamics. When I first got here, I saw no Venezuelans ever. And then post-pandemic, Venezuelans started coming to the border, and the situation in Venezuela is not a good situation. I mean, the elections last year were a complete fabrication, and so there are 7 million Venezuelans living outside Venezuela, and very few of them, less than a million, less than a half a million, have come to the United States, but have come. So that was a demographic shift. When I first got here, I didn't see any Haitians. And then Haitians became a large percentage of the migrant population coming here. Situation in Haiti is horrific. I mean, it is, uh, especially Port-au-Prince, the capital city, 80% of it is controlled by gangs. We've seen the Jesuit community there speaking up about how they cannot safely leave their homes. The Bishop of Haiti, the Cardinal Archbishop, I should say, of Port-au-Prince, released a statement just a couple days ago talking about how dire the situation is in that country. So demographics can change sometimes because of the political realities in sending countries of migrants. So that can impact the demographics. So over the past year or so, I would say the four most common demographics we've seen in this sector of the border have been people from Mexico, Honduras, Haiti, and Venezuela. But at the shelter I was at this morning, there's an individual from Iran. He fled Iran because he converted to Christianity and feared for his life under the government there. There's an individual from Russia who fled because he's a young man and he didn't want to get drafted to fight in the war in Ukraine. So just an example, those aren't very representative, but those happen as well. You can get migrants from any situation who are fleeing persecution.
Do you have a quotation from Ignatius that inspires you and keeps you going? And how do you keep going and not burn out?
Ooh, I guess the quotation from Ignatius that just first jumps to mind, which I don't know if he actually said it or not, but certainly was in his spirit, was when he told Francis Xavier to go and set the world on fire. We're not meant to be contained only to our institutions. The church is not a building, the church is the people of God. And so I go to church every day. And that doesn't mean I go to an institutional building. That means I go to a migrant camp and shelter, and there I encounter the church, I encounter the people of God. And that's why we celebrate the Mass there, not to bring Christ to people, but to witness Christ already present. And it's the people themselves who give me faith. On January 20th, when this announcement went out that all the appointments had been canceled, no more legal entry in the U.S., the next day on the 21st, we went into a migrant shelter in Reynosa to celebrate Mass and visit with people. And there was just so many tears and heartbreak. I mean, people just crying in your arms and hugging and just so upset and so sad, thinking, I know he was anti-immigrant, but I thought the government would at least respect the appointments they've been given. And so after Mass, we opened up the floor for people to share where they're at, what they're feeling. And people said, I'm devastated. I'm heartbroken. I'm terrified. I don't know what's going to happen to me now. And as people were sharing, one lady raised her hand in the back of the room, invited her to stand up, and she said, lo último que se pierde es la esperanza. The last thing you lose is your hope. And she said, I have not lost hope because my hope is not in smartphone. Her hope is not in a smartphone app. Her hope is not in the President of the United States of America. Her hope is in the Lord. And that hope does not disappoint. That's where I place my hope. I've seen a lot of bad border policies. I've seen a lot of suffering on the border. It's not like things were great the last 4 years. I've seen people kidnapped, raped, exploited, robbed, abused, physically tortured, tormented. I've seen people fleeing situations of horrific violence. I've seen people encountering all kinds of troubles along the way. This is just a new version of it. This is just the current reality that we're facing. And so I try to work for justice and for a better world. I try to construct the kingdom of God, the reign of God here on earth. I think that's what we're called to do as Christians, doing our one piece and one part, knowing that ultimately our hope and salvation doesn't rest on our own efforts, but rests on the Lord, and that we are just trying to be his hands and feet, communicating his love and mercy to one another, because that's what we all need in our lives. That's what I need. That's what the people I encounter need. So that's where I find hope is in my faith, knowing that our salvation comes from the Lord who came, who suffered and shares in our suffering, but who ultimately rose on that third day to offer us salvation from sin and death. And I put my faith and hope in that.
Is there any acknowledgement and or understanding of how U.S. foreign policy in these countries and with their governments has contributed to this crisis?
Great question. No, I mean, I would say that's widely misunderstood or underappreciated in the United States. Obviously, migrant advocates, that's often one of our big talking points. I mean, we can't talk about migration flows without talking about what compels people to leave their countries. And that's certainly true in Central America. When I think about migration flows that come from Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador, certainly starting in the 80s, but that reflect policies that predate that for many years. And Mexico, obviously, being another one as well. So yeah, U.S. foreign policy and its history of foreign policy has been a big a big source of both problems in those countries and what's compelled people to leave. I mean, I mean, probably the person asking this question is familiar with this, but just as a quick little snippet, 1980s, we got really tough on crime in this country under Reagan. We started deporting a lot of people, migrants who had been living in California, even from jails. And we said, let's just send them back down to Central America and stop dealing with them. Well, a lot of those migrants had been enculturated into gang culture in California, and they brought that gang culture back to Central America. I mean, we were literally deporting organized crime into these countries where it grew and flourished and created a lot of these cartels that we now know. They had contacts in the United States of America, they had experience working in that, and now we're being sent back to Central America. And they didn't say, okay, now I'm going to go back to subsistence farming. They said, I'm going to continue doing this sort of thing. So that was, us basically directly contributing with our country's policies to creating this culture of crime that is rampant now in Central America. So just as one example of how our policy of even, as right now, as we're focusing on these mass deportations and deporting criminals, like, are we sowing the seeds for further discontent in the countries that we're dealing with? Possibly. I mean, I think we're mostly deporting people who are not actually criminals, but we're just criminalizing because we say they entered illegally. But even those who might have a criminal background in history, are we actually looking out for the best interest of our country or the country we're sending them to? I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
How do you balance providing direct aid with advocating for policy change in alignment with Catholic social teaching?
These are all things we need to balance. And what I would say to lead with is that our emphasis is the pastoral accompaniment and sacramental care. That is our main lane. As Jesuits and as priests in particular, uh, we lean on others to provide much more of the humanitarian aid and do a lot more in the advocacy areas because there are people who have professional expertise in that in the same way that we have professional expertise in sacramental ministry, right? People sometimes tell me like, oh, why didn't you go to law school and become a lawyer so you can help advocate and represent migrants because there's a need for immigration lawyers. I'm like, yeah, there is, but I've done 6 years of school to be a priest. Like, let me be a priest. That's what the world needs that as well. And so we have a lot of needs, and that includes humanitarian aid and that includes advocacy. But there are a lot of great people that we lean on to kind of take the lead on in those areas. Um, but we try to do a little bit of both. And our humanitarian aid is pretty small, but it's something, the aid that we give is something, and we're able to provide out of our means. And the advocacy we do is maybe isn't rewriting immigration law, but if we can be a voice, if we can talk to Senate offices because some advocate we know set up a call, we're happy to do and participate in that. We share our stories with legislators, with politicians, with journalists and things like that. So um, it is a balance, but I would say our top priority is the sacramental pastoral care because that's our lane, that's our real expertise. But any way we can help in those other areas, we're trying to do so, leaning primarily on partners and collaborators.
Are you aware of organizations that serve migrants who have been targeted by the government.
Oh, absolutely. An easy example right now that's gotten some news and we shared in our last newsletter is this family had been living in our area of South Texas for I think almost t over 10 years, 10 to 15 years. And they've got five kids. Four of them were born in the United States. One of those girls, 10-year-old girl, she got brain cancer, got a yeah, tumor, a cancerous tumor on her brain. She was having all this pain, and they took her to the hospital locally. The hospital realized what it was, and they flew her on a medical evac to Houston so that they could have the tumor removed from her brain. And then, so then recently they've been t making trips after that surgery was a little over a year ago up to Houston periodically when she would get like eye pain or severe headaches to have her reviewed by the doctors up there and hadn't had any problems. Well, this couple is undocumented. Okay. So they've got kids who are US citizens born in the United States, naturalized citizens. But the first time they went to take her to the hospital when she was feeling unwell in January after the elections, they had to go through a checkpoint that's about 80 to 100 miles north of the border where you have to go through a checkpoint of immigration. It's some of the safety policies we have here in the country along the border is that anywhere, any road about 100 miles north of here will have checkpoints from immigration. They get stopped by it. They can't produce paperwork. They showed that they've got an immigration attorney. They're actually applying for a visa because they were trafficked for their labor, but they don't have that yet and they showed the medical paperwork. We've got a US citizen here, a 10-year-old girl. She needs to go to her doctor's. They took him out of their car. They put him in detention. They called the hospital, talked to the doctor who said, yes, she is a patient of ours and she needs care and treatment. And despite all of that, within 24 hours, they were deported out of the country. And the couple was being deported and they were given the option to abandon their children. So of course they took their kids with them. But that meant this young girl, this 10-year-old girl who just had a brain tumor, is unable to get up to their hospital in Houston. So Texas Civil Rights Project has stepped in and they've taken on this case. They're sharing it with media. They're putting in a complaint to the federal government, and so they're advocating on their behalf. So TCRP, that's just one example of an organization, the Texas Civil Rights Project, and that's a very particular case that just happened recently. And so a network here in the U.S. that's trying to represent someone who has been beaten up and eaten up and chewed out by our immigration system and policies right now, and how that can have drastic effects even on a U.S. citizen, a 10-year-old girl. But not only should that girl be able to get the medical care she needs in Houston, but her parents should be able to be at her side. This girl's 10 years old. And if we can't find a way to make that happen, again, we are over prioritizing the border of a nation state over human need.
A few months ago, I was hearing that millions of people from many countries were on their way through Mexico to the US border. Was this a lie?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. Certainly, to describe it as millions would be inaccurate, but there were people coming and seeking safety, and they were coming from all over the world. That is true. I mean, people were finding ways to fly into Central or South America and making the journey to the border. People coming from China or Russia or parts of Africa and coming, and most of them were coming and trying to and using the smartphone app and legally entering the country. There was a legal pathway offered. They weren't offered a legal pathway to wait for an appointment in their home country and fly into the US. If we offered that, people would take that. So they were coming to Mexico to be able to use the smartphone app to legally enter the country. In the highest year on record recently during the Biden administration, we had a year where 2 million people entered the country, either through the smartphone app or they entered between ports of entry and were given some paperwork. 2 million entries in the country. Now, that sounds like a lot of people, and that gets publicized. 2 million entries. We are being invaded. Okay. I just want to contextualize that a little bit because numbers are important and you can't just use one number because if you use one number, you can't paint a real picture. During that same year, 1 million people left the country. Okay. That's a lot of people too. That's a lot of people that left. So that means out of your 2 million, you also had a million leaving. So you basically had a net gain of 1 million people. That's still a lot of people. We gained 1 million people in that one year, okay, just through migration. Well, let me remind you how many people live in the United States of America? Over 330 million people. That's a lot of people. We're the third biggest country in terms of population in the world after India and China. We're also the third biggest country in terms of land mass in the world after Russia and the great country of Canada. And so we're a big country and we can receive 1 million people very easily. The context I put it in the United States, if you're running a Jesuit high school that's got 1,000 students, like a typical Jesuit high school, it'd be the equivalent of adding 3 new students every year. Okay, after 4 years, you'd have 12 new students at your school, at a school of 12,000. Now, if you took all 12 students and put all their lockers around your one locker, you might feel like we're being overwhelmed by migrants. But if you spread out those 12 lockers around the school facility, no one would even notice the change. No one would be saying, you're changing my the culture of our school is being changed by this influx, this invasion of migrants. So numbers matter. When you let people enter the country, even the maximum entries we've allowed in US history, 2 million entries, is not as substantial as it sounds like. And if we let them distribute themselves around the country according to need and according to where their contacts and friends are, they can enter into our culture and society very easily without changing our culture, without overrunning our country, being the equivalent of getting 3 new students in your Jesuit high school every year. And we've been a country that's received migrants throughout our history, but we've also been a country that's demonized and criminalized migrants. So is it accurate to say that a lot of people were coming from around the world to Mexico seeking legal entry in the US? That was absolutely true. To call it millions of people, I think, is a mischaracterization of any snippet in time. But maybe over time, you could talk about a number that could even get as high as 2 million. But it's important to contextualize our numbers when we're talking about them. And I think when we put them into our context, I think we can see that it was not an unreasonable amount of migration that was happening. I don't think it was the best form of border policy to make that the one legal pathway that was then encouraging people from around the world to take that pathway, exposing them to all the risks in Mexico, including high rates of kidnapping and exploitation. But that was a pathway we offered to people, and people who are willing to take legal pathways were choosing that one. So I hope that's a helpful response to the question.
What are the biggest humanitarian needs right now, and how has Del Camino adapted to meet them?
Yeah, the biggest humanitarian needs, right? I mean, I would say the humanitarian needs have decreased as the migrant population has decreased. So we continue to bring our aid, but it's been easier for us to do so because we're not visiting a shelter that has 2,000 migrants waiting for an appointment with a smartphone app. That same shelter has 40 people in it. And so the humanitarian needs have decreased per just because the population's decreased, but we're continuing to provide them. What I would say is like the biggest human need, humanitarian need in a human sense is our presence. I mean, there's a lot of organizations that have shut down because they get USAID funding. Okay. So the US government has started to defund our international efforts. So big organizations all of a sudden can't make their visits to shelters. So migrants who are stuck in these shelters right now feel completely abandoned. And so if there's only 20 people in a shelter, we still want to be there because we know that those 20 people need that visit. I mean, not all of them, but certainly there is great need for the presence of people to walk with them, to talk with them. Not just us, not like we're some savior, but just that presence of people saying, "You care, we see you. The church is here. The church sees you. You are the church." These are really important human needs, humanitarian needs in that sense right now. But in terms of material needs, they continue, like food in the shelters, because the shelters have lost funding from the United Nations and from US funding. So there is some need for that, and we're trying to help step up with other orgs to kind of meet those needs. But the per person needs have kind of declined because there's less people. But those are some of the ways we're adapting in that kind of humanitarian needs sense.
Do you see any opportunities for meaningful change or reform in border policies moving forward?
Now is not the right time to ask that question. Uh, but no, I think seeing the border is always changing. I think there are dynamics that could shift. The most pressing one right now, the most obvious, is there is a lawsuit saying that the current policy, the executive order declaring an invasion on the border that prevents any access to entry for asylum seekers, is being challenged in court. I'm no legal scholar, but the ones who I have talked to said it looks pretty obviously unconstitutional, but that could be a fight that takes months or maybe even a year or more. I mean, it's going to go to the Supreme Court. It's going to be appealed up, and we'll see how the Supreme Court rules. I'm optimistic that will change, that will be revoked, but that's when the president's going to swoop in with different policies like the Remain in Mexico policy or Title 42 and try to put some other mechanisms, anti-immigrant mechanisms in place. So it's not the most hopeful thing. If I'm gonna provide some hope, I hate to turn to this, but it's the economic argument. So I'm more about the human argument. I mean that we need to be a country that understands migration as a human dynamic. We need to find ways to provide legal pathways for regulated migration, not an open border where just anybody cross anytime, but legal pathways for regulated migration. And we need to grow those in ways that can help us and help others. But if you don't want to accept the humanitarian argument, can people be compelled by demographics and economics? Our country survives, thrives on migrant labor. We exploit it, we underpay it, we don't provide it protections under the law, but man, do we love it. During the pandemic, we classified certain workers in our country as essential workers so they could keep working throughout the early days of the pandemic. Between 4 and 5 million undocumented migrants were classified as essential workers. Those are the people our president is trying to deport right now. I mean, imagine if those 4 to 5 million people were just deported tomorrow. It's not that easy to do so, but it would cripple our agricultural economy in so many different sectors of our economy, especially construction and agriculture. So we're going to see. We're going to see what happens. But the U.S. economy is already struggling right now. Our threats of terrorists to our friendly neighbors to the north are certainly part of that. But also, we've got no new migrant labor coming into the country, which has been coming in and getting jobs and being employed. And we're looking to deport and arrest a lot of migrant labor. So we're going to see how our economy responds if we get a shortage of workers. We're not having more babies instantly. Those babies aren't becoming working age tomorrow. And so our demographics have been supported by the influx of migrants that we get every year. And that strengthens our economy, strengthens our country. And so you want to give me hope. What is one thing Donald Trump really care about? He really seems to care about the economy. And so this is a crazy hope. This is a totally crazy hope, but I wouldn't be totally shocked if 2 years from now, Donald Trump is saying, I'm inventing this new pathway for laborers to come in our country and to work legally under a visa because we hate criminals and undocumented migrants, but we love good workers and good family people and people of values. It's the Donald Trump visa, and we're going to start offering it to people who come to our border. Maybe we'll even create a smartphone app where they can ask for this visa and come into the country. Basically, he'll reinvent something that maybe already existed, but he'll give it his own name and claim it for himself. So he's completely reversed course on things before. So maybe, just maybe, the economy will force his hand and he'll reverse course on all this around migration and claim victory for himself somehow in the midst of all that. I don't know. That might be a hope and a prayer, but just to theorize that maybe the economic argument could be the one that could help shift our thinking around migration. Um, but that's probably a dream.
Thank you, Brian. We don't have time for any more questions. On behalf of the Jesuits of Canada and for our audience tonight, I want to express our gratitude for your powerful and eye-opening presentation on Del Camino and your ministry there. Your firsthand account of the realities faced by migrants and refugees at the US-Mexico border and the drastic changes in policy that continue to shape their lives gives us much to reflect on. Your work embodies Matthew 25, I am a stranger and you welcome me. In a world where migrants are too often met with barriers rather than open arms, you and your team stand as a witness to Christ's love, ensuring that those forced to flee find not only material aid, but dignity, compassion, and hope. Rooted in Catholic social teaching and the Ignatian mission of being men and women for and with others, your response to these unfolding challenges reminds us of Pope Francis's call to build a culture of encounter. You show us what it means to accompany the vulnerable, to listen deeply, and to respond with faith and action. Thank you for your courage and commitment and your unwavering service to those at the margins. Please be assured of our prayers for you and your team and the many migrants and refugees that you serve. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you to everyone on the call for taking time out of your Thursday to listen. I hope this has been helpful. And I want to say one special word of thanks to the interpreters. I know I'm a fast talker, so God bless you. I hope it went okay for all of our French listeners joining as well. But I appreciate everyone and your prayers. Please do keep us in your prayers and count on our prayers for all of you as well.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank David and Albert and Isabel for their work and technical support tonight. And finally, thank you to all our participants who joined us this evening. Good night.
Good night, everyone. God bless.